So part 2 of this whole weird online drama thing. I don't feel like going into the whole story behind the scenes and whatnot. I've kind of talked about it in various ways before. Anyway, I'll just kind of skip forward to where things seem to be at now and how it does seem to intensify different stages pertaining to negotiating freedoms of the system, right? And not leaving it to the whims of other corrupted measures that infiltrate and supposed to be a part of those types of measures, right? So it's kind of gotten to the point where I was trying to talk in terms of, or making reference to scripture and other things that are kind of like a shared space to have conversations and not really point blame or name people and stuff like that. You know, just like universal dynamics of behavior and stuff. But I just got drawn into this weird drama with like the Kardashian Jenners and their various investments and this battle with Israel on the world stage and certain investments, right? And so I just have to start naming some stuff. We got to name the forces if we're trying to work through it. And so it had been in the past, you know, I was trying to negotiate on behalf of this, like, man, there's a lot to say here, but I'm going to try to generalize it. There's a lot of details because one thing that gets really complex about human behavior is when people don't really seem to have a breakthrough for freedom, they seem to like draw onto themselves a lot of different corrupt maneuvers and behaviors and deflecting and just all of these different types of survival type entrenchments, I guess you would say. And to be quite honest, a lot of people over the years getting involved online have fallen into that, fall victim to that. Then they kind of have to refine their stance and like for me, I'm not looking for some kind of like corrupt scheme to prop myself up with and stuff like that. I mean, if that's all I was looking for, I could have done that a long time ago. But I try to maintain or preserve this type of standard of looking at the system and what actually is freedom. And even if it's a standard that's even beyond myself, like my capacity, I still want there to be this certain standard, right? And I don't want to manufacture a certain standard that then becomes like corrupted again, right? So it's not like I'm telling myself that I've accomplished all of these things. I still am just looking at and assessing it so that we have something toward the future. And also just the curiosity of, and blah, 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 blah. So anyway, it kind of puts me in that situation where as we kind of move through different seasons of things, other ideas surface and other potential corrupted deals surface or times where I have to negotiate through stuff. And so eventually it gets to that point where you have to kind of name the things because the corruption is going to infiltrate and misuse people and misuse situations. And so you kind of have to do it, right? So it seems like something that has kind of come up lately is this stage in this obstruction. So let's see. How do I even want to go into this? At one point within the system, right, we're kind of using the template of the United States and then other similarities in other countries and colonized places. We had talked about in the past negotiating between Native indigenous people and Black Americans and whatnot, and the history there. And among that stage of development, I had seen promising connections where people are trying to signal connections for this certain standard, right, of change and shift. Then in the midst of it, you find people that, and this is where it just gets really complicated, where there's these certain divisions, right? Where there's kind of like these racial divisions, and it's not so much that they want a free system as much as maybe vengeance or supremacy or switched roles of supremacy and all of these things, right? In the midst of it, then we end up having to negotiate religion and belief in what life is like in the midst of those types of behaviors, right? Is that what we're seeking? Other groups will kind of say they could see the reasoning for groups that had been historically marginalized or oppressed wanting vengeance or wanting those switched roles. You also see a lot of generalizations where people are not discerning between what is a standard for corrective human behavior, expectation, or some kind of general standard of just like expectation, I guess. And everything is kind of seen through this lens of being slighted or maligned, or, so there's this psychological battle as well, right? And then we have people that enter into like personal struggles, and so it just becomes more and more entrenched. So when I was saying that I wouldn't always follow the details of what people were referencing or who they were referencing, I meant that because after a while it just in my spirit, it just didn't feel like they were talking about systemic reform or repair. They were just beefing with each other, manufacturing signals and throwing generalizations back and forth, and then getting investments for that on different sides, getting recruitment, and I was just like, I'm not trying to do that. If I was just trying to do some kind of like, I don't know, I kind of feel like it's toxic recruiting of generalization. I mean, some of that functions, that just does kind of happen, because in the realm of communication creates crowds or audiences, and it influences things. So in some ways, that's what happens, right? But in general, at times, it seems like that's all people do. Like, they don't have a vision for repair, corrective measure. They're just making certain inferences or references for certain generalizations or perceptions. Sometimes that just happens, though. No matter like how you're trying to say it, there's going to be a generalization. Even if you say, hey, we're working on this whole like effort of change in the system and whatnot. And so among some of those things had become this inference. So eventually, as I was talking about in some of my previous posts, there had been this instigated division where they had certain groups that were kind of like dividing the Native movement and the Black movement, right? Blacks against Natives. And then they had different investors and different ones buying into those stances and politicizing it and generalizing it and monopolizing it and stuff. So it turned into this whole other like almost like gangster rap beef or whatever. I say that with a tinge of annoyance in my voice because, I mean, I grew up on gangster rap, R&B, all of that stuff. I know the whole thing. I know the story. I even entered into the negotiations of how to remedy some stuff and whatnot. At this point, I'm just kind of annoyed about it because I don't just want that, right? I mean, even some of like the OGs back in the day when they were talking about stuff, it was to put voice to things for change, right? To communicate the need for certain stories and for the sake of change. Even like nowadays, it's like part of this industry and market that seems to work against the very thing it's supposed to do. And so it just becomes annoying to me. I just feel annoyed by it. I just kind of feel angered at people like getting drawn into these generalizations and just acting hostile and having no vision for it just kind of frustrates me. And I just think to myself, like, I'm not looking to make some kind of like manufactured dramatization for some kind of market gain or whatever. It's not what I'm doing, and I never would have started what I was doing if that was simply my intent. And so, we kind of find ourselves in this whole thing. We have industries and different ones making references to each other and whatnot. In the midst of it, though, there were people that seemed to have some kind of balance. Like they know this game, they know how it's played, whatever, So there's that. Then you have people like instigating other groups intentionally against others. And so anyway, we had all this stuff happening over the years. And so then I would find myself thinking, hey, I still got to stay the course. Even if these things become entrenched and resurface and, get fueled in these types of ways, like I'm still going to be about what I'm going to be about and like roll with the tides, I guess, and when these topics come up, try to name them, try to understand it, try to navigate through it. And so I do feel like I've went through the stage of being understanding, and I went through the stage of trying to like negotiate through it. And we're kind of reaching the point where now we're kind of trying to negotiate through political process. What could we do along those lines in terms of like the political process, representation, or things like that, where we can kind of diffuse things, right? In the midst of it, then I get involved with like these other influencers and whatnot that just kind of crazy, like I said, and so it becomes this whole other thing, right? So then I end up so it's basically like becomes a battle of this toxic industry and the hold that this toxic industry has on people. And so then you think about it, and then we're trying to negotiate this whole Israel thing. And we have this toxic industry that has a hold on all these people that seems to be the powers over the ability to actually have reform, making these questionable deals with various ones to pin them against other people, to sow seeds of division, and to make them compliant and dependent on this corrupt system so that they never really have a voice to change the system. So then we see this happening, right? And then it's cloaked in all of this like false sexual freedom against the patriarchy, which what's so entrenched and difficult about that is there is a need for sexual freedom. There is a need to relieve some of the toxicity of what we call the patriarchy or what have you. But it's a very corrupted, deceived likeness of having those types of reform that trick people. I shouldn't say trick because I don't want people thinking coyote. I'm trying to get away from people's like false equivalencies of these sides that deceive people, intentionally corrupt people into making deals against their actual interests so that they actually can't change the system. And you have this like these people caught up in the industry where the industry itself won't let you be free, and so it lets you fight these these type of likenesses of battles that basically just make more money for the industry and are not functionally changing anything. So then we kind of get involved in this, right? There's going to be historical divisions and some of these things that happen. Some of the worst characters that seem to be signaling this continual battle towards me is the Kardashian Jenners, right? Long story. I know if you follow them online, it's hard for you to understand. You think that it's this public appearance of help. You think that they're freeing the system. They're all about God. But no. And I don't really feel like going into the whole story there. But then you find, okay, how is this, how is some of this not what it appears to be, right? So anyway, in the midst of that, then take, for instance, I've been seeing this in my feed. I don't mean to just try to single out Ariana Grande. I don't know what she's going through. I don't follow all the influencers or like the entertainment groups and whatnot. But I have, once in a while, I'll get these like images from the Kardashian, like some of the main ones, like Khloe, Kim, what's the other ones there? Kylie. They're the ones that kind of keep the pace with a lot of that stuff. Some kind of picture of her like drenched in blood, or not the blood one, saying she's listening to Ariana Grande or whatever. And then people making likenesses of her in the industry to all these blood-soaked images, and these blood-soaked images have reference to some of the conversations we were having in the past, but blah, blah, blah. feel like my voice is getting a little bit hoarse. It's a little bit smokier. But anyway, so let me say that. Let me reference that convo, even though I admit that I haven't been following it 100%. I just see little glimpses. But in terms of the perception even in the music video, because they were talking about like Ariana Grande, Kylie Jenner, these blood pictures, right, in the industry, the entertainment industry, having to do with like sexualization, And then this whole recent thing that happened with Perez Hilton. I see him once in a while. I also just don't follow him. So I've been hearing the stories a little bit of the summary and rundown of who he is and and that whole recent blood-soaked imagery. And people kind of saying, well, that's the industry that he was a part of. That's what they're trying to combat. You know, it's these women battling these men, But I guess in the video, in parts of the clips that I've seen people doing breakdowns of the video of Ariana Grande, and people are concerned about her well-being and feeling like she's caught up in an unhealthy industry, and Kylie just kind of like celebrating it or whatever. I was like, okay, what's the story here? A little bit. And so I guess it's like this video where she's in this waiting room, goes in to like be interviewed by these executives, this whole panel of men, right? And they're, I guess, like degrading her and picking out like her appearance and So she goes through all these changes, comes back, you know, continues to try to change and refine herself or whatever in front of these like executives, industry executives, And then eventually it shows her returning with a chainsaw and jumping on the desk and basically like cutting them all up with the chainsaw, and then coming out to this praise from all the women. And she's like blood-soaked, right? So I guess the notion there is this whole storyline that they've been trying to sell for a long time that I'd seen develop before, which the Kardashians and different ones seem to be trying to reference and create likenesses with, is that the issue is like women against the patriarchy and sexual freedom, right? But here's the thing. I think about that and I imagine, okay, I'm not trying to deny that there, you know, that there aren't like, or that there are assholes or what have you as executives and men that act like that and whatnot, or toxic masculinity. But I also think it's deceptive to imagine that what perpetuates that industry is just this whole panel of men, because the Kardashians are bullies. That's how they treat women. They do that to women. Their mother does that to them. Their mother could be sitting on that panel right next to those guys critiquing other women. And they're some of the worst at critiquing other women and doing that to other women. So it's not just the patriarchy, it's the industry. And the industry is exploitative and demeaning and runs through you and tears you apart and then sets you up into a system where you can't get out. And it doesn't show love, it doesn't increase your life, and it invests with other forms of corruption so that you're stuck in this whole reign, you know, like their reign of terror. Thinking about that, and I was like, nah, that's not true. I mean, yes, there are these dominions, there are these panels of dominions that erode and exploit people's lives and attach it to a money system, but those are women that do that too. Powerful women that some of those men don't even always know how to do that. They need women that help them know how to do that. Just like the Epstein thing. A lot of the women were saying he couldn't have gotten as far without the help and the mind behind it of Ghislaine, right? Create this story where it's just like men versus women, and we just want simple sexual freedoms. We just want these innocent sexual freedoms. And then they play to an exploitative industry that they know themselves does not allow those freedoms. And then they lie about who's perpetuating it. And then instead of actually changing the system, then they pull men in to say, oh, you want to behave and not be like these men, let's cut you a deal. So then they entrap all these men into these like monetary deals that they have while they're oppressing other women, while they're oppressing those men and keeping them oppressed, and then refusing actual systemic reforms, right? And then they have these deals with the industry that sell this whole picture of this is what's going on. This is the peace deal. Honor us. This is the path of God. This is like the interpretation of God. This is the system of freedom. Follow these investments and stuff like that. I also wanted to make this other correction. So I kind of knew this, right? We've been kind of having this negotiation between capitalism, socialism, the system, what helps diffuse things. And some people are just very devoted and hardcore capitalist that I don't even think that they mean to like racialize it as much. I mean, maybe to some degree, but because there's stuff within the fabric of how things are negotiated and the flack that they get. But it seems like for the most part, what I'm starting to find is that they're very much just trying to defend what they truly believe is the benefit of capitalism, if it were functioning in the proper way to diffuse these like oppressive approaches or corruptions of it, right? So it shifts into this whole like argument of socialism, capitalism, and that kind of thing, right? And so what they were kind of making reference to was that in the midst of it, some of these like tensions among different people groups, certain people groups are violent or hostile or not really negotiating for freedom, but hostility or, things like that. I don't deny that. That is a part of entangled in all of this stuff. There are groups that they just want to be hostile. They're not going to transform the way they think about it. There's a variety of stories as to why and backgrounds as to why. For me, I still try to stick with what is freedom, though. Not what's pretend freedom, not what's like a corrupted deal to make. Like what really is freedom and how to examine these systems and proposals, because times go by and people get involved in all these various things, and then, over time, they're just like, we're just going to go with this thing, this, that, and the other. And it's not really the freedom, that people are seeking. So I'm still trying to stay within that intent, right? That's still what I'm like examining and thinking about and incorporating, like assessing human behavior and stuff like that. So I was imagining that and I was thinking, I can admit that is there. There are times where some of the approach that people are taking does not intend for actual transformative approach. And I do seem to find that with the Kardashian-Jenners and some of the deals that they make with people, it seems questionable. It seems like a lot of people are either greatly deceived, they fall for the public perception, they don't really know what's going on, or they're very much attracted to corrupted power, and that's actually what they want. It got me into this, like thinking about this, right? There was this tension that seemed to be developing in the conversation that I had seen over the years following various ones like Ice Cube's contract with Black America and trying to find tangible ways for improvement, trying to diffuse people sowing seeds of division and whatnot. I don't always follow everything, and so sometimes when they're battling something, I don't know who it's applying to, and it kind of can get misconstrued, and then I chime in, But now recently I'm kind of seeing, as I'm seeing stuff in the feed that the feed starts showing me, I'm like, oh, okay. People have been keeping an eye on some of these like corrupt developments with like the Kardashian-Jenners and influencers and opinions and the false perception that's being sold to the public. So now I kind of have to speak on it to some degree. I don't like to spend too much time on this, but something that you do kind of find, so in thinking about this, and I wanted to, like if I was to have more of a private conversation with different ones going back and forth, something that I'm thinking about is, for one, I don't think it's been healthy for people to be dependent on the industry, the entertainment industry, and some of these forces that people have come out and testified about. Even if they make a lot of money, it's a type of control mechanism that's very entrenched, and then they start to find over time they don't really have freedom to talk about changing or reforming the system, that they just become further and further entrenched and sold into the system, and at times utilized through those investments to be scapegoated, as anytime the industry needs someone to scapegoat in terms of like industry corruption, then they end up being a lot of times a scapegoat. So now as I think about it, I'm like, yeah, it is true that other people, when we're trying to talk about reforms, and they say some of these investors in the industry are not the types of negotiations we're trying to make, or like the standards we're trying to reach, because it's like selected for a type of hostility. It's kind of like a form of systemic hostility. And so then people try to put a voice to it, whether it be maybe Ariana Grande chopping them up, or like a misplaced where it kind of leaves the door open for others that are actually some of the forces behind it, because they can't really fully break out of it, right? Or you have some of these characters where it's like, I think about some of these characters that have this money or want to invest or competing for this type of influence or these negotiations, and I just think to myself, hey, I wouldn't want you as a leader. Maybe you have all this money and whatnot, but you're not really showing character of, like, you are being hostile. Like, let's be straight. Like, you are being hostile, and you've been situated in that position through some questionable forces. And what anchors a lot of that industry is not giving people freedom. And so you're not like manifesting attributes of freedom. You seem like you've been in a constant battle of corruption, and you've kind of become corrupted. And so you kind of have to name that and just say, there is this sense where there needs to be other freedoms for, whether it be Black Americans or other ones in the industry, where it's like, no, that isn't really working, right? It's not really working for systemic change. It's very much entrenched, and we're seeing the levers being pulled, right? And so, no, like, we have to kind of name it and say, no, that isn't an attribute of gains. You see these people swoop in and very much control every aspect of it geopolitically, and put the story over, like what freedom and peace and all of this looks like. And we're seeing this take place on a grand, massive scale, and they're giving you Trump change. They're still controlling it, though, right? And so when I think about that, so back to this other conversation about like capitalism, socialism. I think what we find when we were talking about private property and stuff like that, like looking all the way down at some degree. So something in my mind, so to like introduce what I'm thinking about when I'm like mulling over this. When you talk about socialism, people talk about owning the means of production, right? And I want to look into this more and have a conversation about this, but it's like owning the means of production. Owning the means of production, which is things like the tangibles, the physical things that people use to make money, whether it be tools, infrastructure, stuff like that. People, I think, seem to assume it also just means like owning corporations, owning institutions, full ownership to the government and stuff like that. So it's just something to like negotiate. But it does fall into the realm of some type of ability to be integrated into the physicality for representation, or to like be built upon, right? And so then this gets into the question where capitalism tries to argue and situate its position on these systemic negotiations, and then says at the base there needs to be some form of the physicality, which is private property. So we've kind of talked about that in other recordings, this idea of private property and some of the pros and cons there, that in some sense, if there was a mechanism by which people can be integrated into that type of systemic investment, that can be a possibility for building upon and creating assets and integration and community and whatnot, as pertaining to some of the attributes of capitalism, a corrected version, maybe not such a corrupted version and whatnot. So in the midst of this conversation, that's what I'm thinking about, right? So I'm thinking about the tangibles. The idea where some socialists will say there's something to do with the means of production. It doesn't always, the physicalities. Or capitalism will say there's something to do with capitalism in terms of private property, the physicalities, the starting point of something physical, tangible. And there's different ways to go about it. And then that's where people are trying to have, I think, good faith conversations on what does that look like? What kind of tangibles? What kind of means of production? What, like, is it some kind of ownership in property? Is it some kind of ownership in some institutions? Is it some kind of ownership in some of the shared, a certain portion of the shared space of infrastructure? What does that mean when you're looking at a shared space of infrastructure? To what degree, right? So that's in the back of my mind what I'm thinking about when I'm imagining some of these like ongoing conversations, right? In scripture, so back to the scripture thing because it gives imagery. In scripture, the tangible or the point of reference is the temple, the work of the temple, and then the laws in reference to the temple, right? And then by that standard, and it could be looked at as a type of like shared infrastructure that they're all invested in and keeps a reference point, is the point by which then they have their allocations of land, and then from the land, the various developments, right? I talked about the whole issue with the temple, though, like there's times where it becomes corrupted as well. So then there's questions as what needs correction there? Is it the standard or like, da-da-da-da. But anyway, that's another example where at the base, there's kind of like a shared infrastructure, and then from there is like private property. But it also depends on continuing in certain proper standards, right? Like standards of justice unto the temple, or it all just becomes destructive. Anyway, in thinking about that, I do tend to still think there's different conversations going on, whether it be in the Native community, the Black community, different ones that need representation, certain rights and justice and whatnot. In the midst of this, we also have these religious conflicts, just like I keep saying, a variety of things. But when you think about, for instance, like there is this difference. So conversations over the years that had seemed to allude to is that certain communities in the U.S. will have certain types of representation, some kind of tangible, documented representation in the government. And from there, they can develop, and there still is tough negotiations. You don't, just like any kind of political campaign, you're not always going to get what you're advocating for. There's times where it becomes politically difficult and obstructed. But in general, at least the mechanism, the base by which you negotiate, the tangible allocation and distinction and definition is there. So it did seem like over the years that kind of was introduced within these conversations, where how come other groups, some kind of representation in the government, and it's a way that they can select for integration and representation and ordering the negotiations among the community and whatnot. And I even advocated for that. I feel like I agree that would be a good place somehow or another. Some kind of distinction in the government, like we have for Native people, we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then there's all these other places for negotiation and whatnot. Like I said, it also gets threatened where every so years there's cycles of getting rid of us and erasure and eroding it and eroding gains, and there's times where we're the fun levels of political obstruction, whereas it's there and it's kind of a functional place of growth and progress as well. And so for me, I was kind of arguing, my point was, there's also representation within the government with Jewish Americans, and not even just Jewish Americans, but Jewish and Israel representation or Jewish diaspora. And I think there's some Asian, I can't remember. I had looked years back and I can't remember all of the departments and whatnot. I did find there is something for civil rights and stuff like that, but even that's generalized. I think what I'm trying to introduce is that I do think there needs to be something kind of tangible. It's not like we can give Black Americans reservations or certain necessary territories, but there could possibly be some kind of representation in the government or something. So that's something kind of benchmark to think about, right? Something that then helps to develop and implement and kind of channel or direct certain types of investment and negotiating and panels of those to negotiate among communities and stuff like that. Maybe even incorporating a way to have advocacy for those in the different industries or, other things like that. Things that are the tangible needs for developing communities. And so I was thinking, like that, even developing education, stuff like that, education materials. So that was on my mind, things like that. Even though I also know that there are a lot of effort and a lot of influence for waging the battles in the public perception have come from the industry, the entertainment industry. There's a lot of good things. There's a lot of people telling good stories, and our generation is a product of people that had seen and visualized some diversity on TV and acclimating into the understanding of other people's lifestyles and stuff like that. There's definitely good things from the entertainment industry, but we're also finding there's also these kind of measures of keeping a hold on it and a control over it. And when the going gets tough and we're really seeking for reforms or change in the world, then it's a force that seems to be a major blockage, right? In the midst of that, it seems to have a tremendous hold on the Black community, even to where numerous voices that make a lot of money. So you kind of realize it's not just the amount of money that you make, but an infrastructure by which you can negotiate change with and among and be represented among. It seems as though their voices or the ability to look into what's going on there is not heard or recognized. And then it causes you to look at, all right, how do we approach this idea of this force, this seemingly world influential force that has to do with connections with the industry? And they're very much involved with investments with the Black community. And is that really freedom? And why does, obviously what I'm seeming to introduce is that it's not freedom. There's a lot of money going through there. There's a lot of tentacles around people's lives there. A lot of guarding of where the money goes and what it influences, and who it can scapegoat or not scapegoat, just all of these things. And there seems to be something very unhealthy about it, something very lawless about stuff behind the scenes. I'm not trying to go after and purify everything to some major point, as much as saying, how do you diffuse that? How do you at least start giving a voice or a way to navigate that, right? But what I also am saying though is I look at it as, so it's developing this perception. It seems to be this driving force right now that's developing this perception in control of all of these investments and maneuvering the public perception in all these investments. And it's characterizing itself as being this reform and this system force for the Black community. And then you see other people and advocates coming out saying, no, it's not. They're not free. There's other things they have to do. This is a false perception. They actually have tremendous control over their lives. Here's the thing, if we're trying on this idea of, is this a systemic option for us to appeal to? Is this a version or an example for us to be led by or to join forces with? And I'd say, heck no. No, it is not. It's a lot of money and it's a lot of false perception, but it follows all the way to the geopolitical corruptions that we're trying to be free from, and it forces them to have to play to it and invest in it and doesn't allow them the freedoms to get out of it. I need to appeal to some people that looking at the differentiation, right? A lot of the violence and the hostilities, we could say there's reason for it. There's a lot of oppression and burden and whatnot. There's a lot of false equivalencies that people make where they don't judge things by the same standard, and I get that, right? But I think there's different areas that we're trying to remedy. There's some of us that are doing boots on the ground, community development, advocacy for change, ways to diffuse that. And they also want to be free from some of the corrupt aspects of the industry and the apparatuses of hostility from the industry. And so I think if we support that and say, how can we negotiate ways to implement that type of corrective undergirding for communities marginalized through the system and whatnot, and have it be distinct, so we don't put this all together as distinct from this false power that is projecting this type of freedom and prosperity through this entertainment industry with these corrupt investors and whatnot that are not giving them freedom at all. They're corrupting the ability for that freedom. I look at it, if I was imagining it, like, I have to bring the whole scripture to it, because it's like, can the scripture really, because I've talked before about how I use scripture as like behavioral mapping, and I try to gauge, like, does it really stand the test of time of gauging human behavior? So at one level, I want to differentiate here. There is true legitimacy to bring freedom for those oppressed in the system. Tangible ways to build the community from the ground up. Mutuality, freedom, justice, all of that. In the midst of it, there's these corrupt forces that sound like freedom, that sound like God, that talk this way, and there's no freedom or truth about it, right? They're focused on a lot of other things, and they infiltrate themselves into these stories, and they try to form these likenesses and references and get people to play the wrong game and be functional death traps as they distract them and corrupt them, and sell false stories and likenesses about them, and sow seeds of division and da-da-da-da-da, because that's a lot of what the industry also does, right? It has to keep you unstable, distracted, dysfunctional, all of these other things, so you are exploitable, sellable, and so that you look to them as peace as they control the money in the system and proclaim this type of corrupted peace to the world or whatever, when it's nothing like that actually, right? Think about that, what kind of comes to mind, and maybe I'll have a different opinion later, but for right now, what kind of comes to mind is the story in scripture, the climate that Jesus finds himself in, right? And he has these different battles, right? There's a battle against the religious establishment in Jerusalem, part of the temple, and become corrupt, right? They're supposed to be this infrastructure that speaks on behalf and represents transformation. They become corrupt by the money and the system and their connection to the powers. So that's one of the battles, right? Then there's a battle just among the different people, trying to get, the people that should be able to recognize the need for negotiation to kind of come to an agreement, but there's a lot of contention there. So there's those types of negotiations. Then there's this other battle, this strange dynamic where there's Herod, right? The Herod. And it's not as though there aren't some seeming truths that Herod seems to espouse, this Herod character. There's a lot of different Herods. It's like a label for a lot of different ones within this lineage, having a seat at the table, what have you. But they become basically, so eventually there are like really corrupt Herods. The Herod that has this like unresolved historical animosity, acts crazed, and tries to kill anybody that would ever seem to be some kind of competition. He's just like a psychopath, right? Then there's these other Herods that they're kind of corrupt, this, that, and the other, just different leadership styles, right? Basically, though, just kind of corrupt and obsessed with these frameworks and dynamics. Instead of just breaking out and making their own way, they just become fixated on some of these like power dynamics. At the time when Jesus, there's this Herod, right? This Herod character. He kind of takes a different kind of strange, approach. He doesn't seem at the time like he cares enough to like go off and like have someone chase down different movements and kill them. I mean, maybe, yeah, it kind of does seem like that. But at least in the story that we see, that's not his main emphasis. He doesn't seem threatened by it at all. He seems kind of fixated at the establishment. he's situated in this like client king role. He's like a client king, like a token king. And it seems like he's trying to be the image of the king of the Jews and the leader and the proper relationship of type of battled interaction between what is the proper place to be situated as like Jewish, and he's from different lineages. There is some Jewish lineage there, but there's also some kind of like corrupt history there. And so he kind of seems like he's masquerading as like trying to play that role. But people pretty much know he's just like a client leader. He was propped up by the government. He doesn't really have the spirit of what they're about or the movement. He just seems like he likes the appearance of it. He likes the token gesture of it. He's like that kind of character, right? His lineage prior, as I was saying, was like absolutely corrupt. Some different ones would like absolutely go out and battle various ones and kill various ones and kill off their competition. And they just really were rivals for that power. They just wanted the appearance of that power. But as I was saying, at this time, he seems more of kind of like neurotic, or like he seems like a different behavioral dynamic of a leader. He seems kind of like, he's kind of like ruled by the group. He might be, I don't know, maybe you would say a little Epstein. He might be a little Epsteinish, where it's like, yeah, he kind of wants that power. He's playing the role, but he's corrupting it. He's making deals. He's doing this and that, whatever. He's ruled by these women. So like, he kind of gauges what's popular in society. He's like, yeah, this is popular, that's popular, whatever. Kind of keeps his eye on stuff, but he's kind of like, I don't know, like just, I was going to say other stuff, but I'm censoring myself a little bit. But anyway, he then gets like controlled by these women. He gets controlled by, they throw this party, and he kind of gets the whole the glam in his eyes. They know that they can get what they want. So like, he's not at this point wanting to go out and hunt people down necessarily. He might kind of do that. He seems to have that character, but at this point, he's not really looking at the movement of Jesus and them as something he's totally focused on, because he seems to be focused on the establishment. He seems to be referencing like, I'm also trying to take down the establishment because that's my, maybe not. He just keeps his eye on like the powers, and he doesn't seem to look at them as like having that type of competing power, because they're not like trying to produce that type of competing power. So he doesn't resonate with their movement because it's like too transformative. He's like, oh, these are just like good guys. They're just trying to like make positive change. They're not like battling for power. But the women around him recognize that the movement is dangerous because they're trying to call out corruption. And these women seem to be managing some of the corruption behind the scenes. And so they know that the power that he has is like these perceptions and these parties and being wined and dined and stuff like that. And so during one of the parties, when he's like probably like liquored up and all of that, and he has this social pressure of this performance pressure around him, she comes out and asks in front of everybody. She kind of sets up the situation. It's like his wife. She sets up the situation and then sends out her younger daughter to seduce the crowd. Once they're all seduced and liquored up and whatnot, they're all praising them for this seduction and whatnot, or something to that effect. And then he says to his wife, or something like this. This is just a summary. How can I thank you, whatever. And because he just loves the love of the crowd. He loves the manufactured love of the crowd, it seems like. And he's like, how can I thank you? Or, da da da. So in front of everybody, she says something like, I want the head of John the Baptist. And of course, he's like one of the main people leading, and people don't yet fully understand the influence of Jesus yet. So basically, long story short, through this pressure, this seduction, she gets him to have John the Baptist killed. Of course, it really intensifies. Could you imagine? There's this palpable movement and revolution happening. And then one of the people involved gets killed as a token gesture from this client king, at the service to his wife and their seductive managing of events and societal perceptions and stuff, right? So that's Herod, the king, quote unquote, king of the Jews. Imagining when I see this is I feel like this is what the system has tried to corruptly offer as a type of managing for the appearance of gains in the system, or try to manage recruiting people into this crowd. And that's what it seems like the entertainment industry does. And it seems like it's kind of like a Herod, right? And it sells itself as saying, hey, come into the system. Because everybody now, they look back and they know Herod was a corrupt king. It wasn't legitimate. He was using technicalities to have that imagery, to be in that position, saying it was like proper historical protocol. He was a legitimate heir, blah, 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 all of this stuff. And he was corrupt. He was easily swayed. He was controlled by these women. They managed everything around him. They would force his hand to do all of this corrupt stuff. He actually liked a lot of it. And so that's how, when I think about it, I think that's the movement that the industry seems to be selling to people. The Hollywood entertainment industry is kind of this Herod, right? Herod isn't the legitimate means by which Jesus produced transformation. Yes, he had to critique the system, but he went the right way, like through the temple and through the establishment and whatnot. He didn't corrupt it and usurp it to kind of develop this other corrupted power through the Herod aspect of things. He just dismantled it from within, right? And that's the way I kind of see some of this. When people say, no, these movements are hostile, this isn't real transformation, there's truth to that. Those industries and the way they prop people up is false. That's not false systemic reform. That's not actual freedom. That's not looking out for your community. That system won't allow you to look out for your community. And it's managed by these corrupt people around them. So let's not be deceived. There's a lot of women that help them manage those corruptions behind the scenes. And yes, there's a lot of corrupt men as well. Those women keep a careful eye on who to manage, who to police, who to destroy, who to leverage investments against. And they're directly in line with some of the most corrupt powers geopolitically. And that's how they get their benefit. And that's how they prop you up to play this game where you think that it sounds like religiosity, it sounds like transformation, it sounds like peace, it sounds like all of these maneuverings or what have you. What's so difficult is at the same time, even though it's true that that's a corrupt kind of limb of direction that things are going, there is actual change that needs to still be made. So let's imagine Jesus didn't just go and say, hey, Herod, knock it off, stop it. He had to change the whole system. He also had to diffuse the ability for Herod to corrupt the corruption. So it was like corruption and corruption. And false leadership and corrupt leadership and hostile leadership. And so in the meantime, then it's just these questions of what is change then, right? They seem to have these where they're switching and becoming even more sneaky, where now it's oh, let's just make a deal across the way. You know, it's like, no, we're not trying to make a deal with corruption. We're still trying to be transformative. A lot of these forces and these investors that are part of a corrupt system that very much intend to still be corrupt have not showed, at least to my estimation, an inclination at all of changing their ways or transforming their methods. It all just fits in with a corrupted system of appearance and managing crowds for the sake and intention to still be within the corrupt system, to still corrupt and manage and try to destroy actual reforms and change, and to buy people off and to work overtime to exploit and produce these false stories and all of these things, right? I think there's other things that I was going to talk about. I wanted to, I guess here, I'll say this really quick. I do intend to talk about Islam some more. I do realize there's some contentious topics that you see, the way that it's sold out in the public, all of these things, right? I do intend to want to go into those conversations. It is useful for people when they use the ways by which they've selected this imagery or these little fueled or provoked stories, and then they use that as a reason to justify scapegoating Islam and whatnot. And so I want to talk about that as well. It's not as though I approach it as though I agree with everything that Islam has placed its name on and whatnot, but I want to properly enter into it to allow for a differentiation of things. For instance, there is kind of this sense where when you see people make reference to those that are covered, right, the hijab or other religious clothing and coverings, they kind of say these practices that diminish women and their rights is never going to be able to merge with the West, you know, what have you. And so they make references to oppressing women and minimizing their sexual freedom as, like compared to the freedoms and the sexual freedoms of the West. And I just think there's so much deception there. There's so much behind the scenes that it's given that appearance. It's given the appearance of this false sexual freedom and this forced, coerced, systemic false sexual freedom. And it doesn't really approach it as proper reforms or proper ways to actually incorporate stages of those types of freedoms. And so you see this divide, right? You see certain ones resisting and saying, no, we're not going to enter into that type of sexualized perception of freedom because we don't believe that it's true sexual freedom. And I tend to think there's truth to that. Would I take it as far as, as it's gone? I'm not in that cultural context, but I can, kind of reflect on what I see in terms of systemic influences that exacerbate some of these tensions and push people into these types of, whether it be physical enclosures or needing an attempt to try to escape and whatnot, or exacerbating certain divisions between cultures. I have seen that take place. That does happen. And it isn't a way by which you increase freedoms. And it isn't accurate to compare it to other systems that say, no, we do have the supreme version of sexual freedom. And just like what I've been saying, no, it's not. It's a false appearance of sexual freedom where you're using sexuality to exploit people and hinder them. And it goes all the way down geopolitically to how you're oppressing other groups. It's not actual freedom. Even when you look at various ones where it's like, these like people trapped in these sexually exploitative industries and whatnot. It's like, there's just so much to say there, right? A lot of things to say there. But anyway, I'm just going to leave it at that for now.